See, it's great when we all work together and come up with a solution. Qu'on ouvre les portes. Let's open the doors. Oh, right, the speaker. Yes. Remember last week? They want you to sit. There you go. There is the direction. J'ai aucune idée. Sit, 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 sit. Well, there was somebody back here telling us to sit down. Yeah. There you go. Now we know what's going on. Live action shot, so let's just sit in our seats, and we'll start off with statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Stevenson, we'll start again. Stevenson, Richmond East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, the Richmond Sockeyes Junior Hockey Club honored a local hero as they retired the jersey of Ray Sawada, who passed away at the age of 38 while playing a recreational hockey game earlier this year. Ray Sawada played his junior hockey for the Richmond Sockeyes from 2001 to 2003, and he was selected 52nd overall in the NHL draft by the Dallas Stars in 2004. Ray retired from professional hockey in 2016, became a Burnaby firefighter, and lived with his wife Nicole and their 2 daughters in Richmond. Richmond Arena was standing room only with friends, family, the local hockey community, and firefighters as we all witnessed Ray's jersey raised to the rafters. The Burnaby Firefighters Charitable Society presented a donation for $27,000 in Ray Sawada's memory to set up a bursary subsidizing hockey players with $1,000 per year for 27 years. Firefighters also presented Ray's jersey from the World Police and Fire Games held in Winnipeg this year to Richmond native Doug Patterson, the first captain and current president of the Richmond Sockeyes. The memory and legacy of Ray Sawada will continue forever in Richmond.
Yeah. The honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
I rise today to share the joy and spirit of Christmas that is deeply woven into the fabric of our communities in Lambton, Kent, Middlesex. In our communities, Christmas is more than a holiday. It's a celebration of Christ's birth. It's a season of unity and warmth that brings together families and neighbors, echoing the rich traditions and vibrant culture that define us. This year, I've had the immense pleasure of attending Santa Claus parades in many of our communities. Each parade was a spectacular display of community spirit and festive cheer, showcasing the unique charm of each town. The festive spirit is alive and well in our communities. In the coming days, I look forward to attending more celebrations throughout the region where our sense of community and shared joy truly exemplifies the spirit of the season. As we come together to celebrate, let's continue to spread kindness, laughter, and joy. After all, it is the most wonderful time of the year. I wish everyone a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, and a season filled with happiness, health, and prosperity.
Hey. The honourable member for Brampton East. I have Brampton East here. Yeah, there you go.
Brampton.
The honourable member of Brampton South.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, parliamentarians can achieve a lot when they are working together, and when it comes to global public health, we can do exactly that through Unite, an international interparliamentary network for global public health. Unite members are committed to working towards the promotion of efficient and sustainable policies for improved global health system in alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As the North American Director, I worked with the representative from more than 100 countries, highlighted Canada's leadership, and discussed best practices. By working together, parliamentarians can play a key role in strengthening public health in Canada and around the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Oise. Mr. Speaker, the commemoration of the Polytechnic massacre is a duty of remembrance out of respect for the victims and their loved ones, but also a duty to ensure that this never happens again. Since the massacre of 14 women in 1989 at the hands of a fanatical misogynist, every year we say, never again. And yet, every year is currently marked by an ever-increasing number of feminicides. We have a duty to find a collective response to this trend. We owe it to Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Degnaud, Anne-Marie Edouard, Maud Avirnik, Barbara Klushnik-Vidayevich, Marie Lagagnère, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud, and Annie Turcotte. Mr. Speaker, 34 years later, and now more than ever, we have to say never again. The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, today marks the 25th anniversary of Loisirs Sport Outaouais. Its mission is highly commendable since it promotes the development of our communities. For 25 years, Loisirs Sport Outaouais has been ensuring that young people with reduced mobility and seniors have access to quality outdoor recreation and activities. In this way, municipalities can offer the citizens' dynamic living environments. I would like to extend my warmest thanks to the entire team for their commitment. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the remarkable work of the Loisirs Sport Outaouais team in the participation of the Outaouais delegation in the Quebec Games. The young people of our region will treasure their memories. Happy 25th anniversary to Loisirs Sport Outaouais. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, it's with great honour that I welcome the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples to Parliament Hill this week. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, or CAP, is one of 5 national Indigenous representative organizations that advocates for over 800,000 Métis, status and non-status, and Southern Inuit Indigenous people living off reserve in Canada. CAP National Chief Elmer St. Pierre emphasizes the pressing need for reconciliation to translate into action as critical issues affecting Indigenous peoples off reserve are often overlooked. CAP's dedication to raising concerns from housing to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, healthcare, and the over-incarceration of Indigenous individuals underscores the gravity of the challenges Indigenous peoples face daily. The reminder that the government must ensure equal opportunities and access to programs for all Indigenous peoples is a call for justice and inclusivity. After over 5 decades of advocacy, CAP remains steadfast in its commitment to Indigenous people and their needs. Welcome to Parliament Hill.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Mr. Speaker, today in my home city of Halifax, we pause for the acknowledgement of the 106th anniversary of the Halifax explosion. On December 6, 1917, as World War I raged on, the collision of SS Mont Blanc and SS Imo in Halifax Harbour resulted in the greatest human-made explosion to that point in history. 2,000 people were killed, 9,000 more were injured, hundreds of acres of our city were immediately erased, and our north end vanished from the map. In the immediate wake of the disaster, citizens rallied together. Neighbors became first responders, navigating the wreckage to aid those in need. This collective response showcased the strength and unity embedded in the fabric of Halifax as we know it today. Our journey from tragedy to triumph is not just a historical chapter that we acknowledge on this day once a year. Our ongoing resilience is a living testament to the enduring strength of our community forged on that day. Today in Halifax, we pay our respect to those lost by building a city that honors their memory.
The Honourable Member Pierre Fond-Delors.
Mr. Speaker, Sunday marked the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. La thème des nations.
The United Nations theme for IDPG was focused on the Sustainable Development Goals.
That we make sustainable development a reality for persons with disabilities. The principle of nothing without us, which means that we work in partnership with the disability community, is what guides a government, is what guides disability and inclusion. This helps us to achieve our goal. Recently, we launched an online tool which will allow Canadians to give their input on how the regulations for the disability benefit will be implemented. The benefit is a cornerstone of our disability inclusion plan. It helps to reduce poverty. It will be a supplement and will not replace existing supports. Together, we will do this. We need to do this. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, on December 6, 1989, we lost 14 women in the Polytechnique massacre. These women violently lost their lives simply because they were women. This cowardly act of violence violated our core value as Canadians and robbed these women of their freedom and lives. It is our duty to remember their memory, their loved ones, and all victims of gender-based violence. This tragedy reminds us that 34 years later, women continue to be the main victims of violence, and we must continue to fight against hatred and violence against women in all of its forms, including harassment, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. I stand up loudly and clearly to declare that we will never forget their names. Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Cognan, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Degnaud, Anne-Marie Edouard, Maud Havernick, Barbara Kluznik-Vadajvik, Marcy Lagnier, Marcy Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michelle Richard, Annie St. Laurent, and Annie Thurat. In their memory, we will continue to fight to end violence against women. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attack on the École Polytechnique on the 6th of December 1989 remains a tragedy forever etched in our memory. 14 young women, intelligent and determined, killed simply because they were women. The pain, indignation, and incomprehension are still with us today. Let us honour their memory by continuing to work together to eliminate all forms of gender-based violence and to create a safer environment by eliminating certain firearms. Everyone is concerned by this, and everyone should be concerned by this. Every woman has the right to live and pursue her dreams without fear of violence. On this National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, let us denounce this violence and reaffirm our commitment to creating a Canada where women's rights are fully respected, where safety is a reality for all, and where diversity is celebrated in a spirit of mutual understanding and inclusion.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Speaker has lost the moral authority to preside over this House. The role of Speaker requires impartiality and nonpartisanship. The Speaker betrayed the trust of this House when he gave greetings at the Ontario Liberal Convention. Yes.
We do have a process in which we are following about this particular issue. Talk of the speaker in the chamber outside of within those rules cannot happen. So we cannot bring the question or talk about the speaker during this time. So I apologize to the honourable member, but I'm going to have to call that out of order. The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Now that the Environment Minister's job is on the line, Liberals are increasingly more desperate to kill the carbon tax carve-out in C234. Just in time for Christmas, this panicked Prime Minister ordered his hand-picked senators to exclude barn heating from any carbon tax relief in the bill. It's ideology above all else for this government. They would rather see millions of Canadians go hungry than provide farmers with carbon tax relief. Bill told me he paid $14,000 in carbon taxes this fall, and that in this environment of rising costs and declining revenues, it's a huge hit to his farm. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. He's taxing farmers who grow the food, truckers who ship the food, and the stores that sell the food to everyday Canadians who are struggling to buy food. Liberals and their coalition allies are punishing Canadians by making everything more expensive. Enough is enough. Conservatives will grind their high-tax agenda to a halt until this Prime Minister removes the carbon tax on farmers, families, and First Nations.
The Honourable Member for Lac Saint-Louis. Congratulations to the 9 students from John Addop CJEP on Montreal's West Island who have distinguished themselves by being the only students in North America to sit on the jury for the Prix Goncourt for secondary students. This Prix Goncourt enables about 2,000 French students, with an exception of one international cohort, so this one, to read and study the selection of novels in the running for the Goncourt Literature Prize and to display their favourite choices. Inspired and guided by their teachers Ariane Bessette and Daniel Rondeau, these 9 Francophile students with a passion for literature all volunteered to diligently read 16 books in 8 weeks. I'm enormously proud of this group, which has a high concentration of Anglophones and Allophones, which reflect the great diversity of the West Island of Montreal. Congratulations to Alexa Bowers, Camila Michel, Contreras Zarate, Anna Mullins, Nahid Zorosi, Stefania Pilicheva, Jeremy Plant, Sofia Q, Andreas Sanchez Bentiez, and Magali Shimotakahara.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Keewatin-Okaski.
Mr. Speaker, the guns silenced, the bombs and missiles grounded, a ceasefire by any other name. For a few days, some sense of peace in Israel and Palestine. But now the killing has begun again in Gaza. Once again, innocent civilians, children, women, dying at horrendous rate. But where is Canada? Where is the world? We now say we are concerned about the number of Palestinian civilians killed. We hear the talk again of a two-state solution. How much of it is talk when you have the Prime Minister of Israel telling Israelis that he is the only thing standing between them and a two-state solution? Canada must be an unequivocal voice for peace and diplomacy. It starts with ending our complicity in the arms trade and in providing ongoing diplomatic cover for those that have no intention of supporting peace, security, and justice for Palestinians. Have we not learned from history? This is a conflict that will repeat itself over and over again unless there is a political solution.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, we are celebrating the 350th anniversary of the City of Terrebonne with a mandate of organising festivities. The 350th anniversary corporation has put on 9 signature events attended by nearly 100,000 people and supported by some 20 community projects. In addition, the City provided additional planning for events. I'd like to thank all of the kind-hearted people who have devoted themselves to our city over the past few months and who are in Ottawa today. The Mayor of Terrebonne, Mathieu Traversy, and a special thanks also to Céline Durand, Director General of this corporation. We also have the work of Monsieur Mayor Dufresne and Lévesque. Thanks to you all, to your teams, and to the hundreds of volunteers and to everyone who came out. We were able to celebrate all the pride we feel for our city. So a big 350th anniversary thanks to the organisers. And we look forward to the 400th anniversary. And for one last time in this House of Commons, happy 350th anniversary to Terrebonne.
The Honourable Member for Oxford.
Last night, the Liberal-appointed senators gutted Bill C-234, which will cost our farmers nearly $1 billion in carbon tax by 2030. Shame. Farmer Gord in Oxford paid $50,000 for the carbon tax just to run his farm. Thanks to the Liberals, it is now cheaper to buy Mexican asparagus shipped 38,000 kilometers away than it is to buy asparagus grown in Oxford. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, Canadians are struggling to put food on their tables. We are facing a cost of living crisis like never seen before, with tent cities popping across our communities and homelessness increasing. More and more hardworking Canadians are now relying on food banks. But instead of axing the carbon tax to lower food prices, this panicking Prime Minister spent the weekend begging his senators to kill this bill. The Liberal government has ruined Christmas for our families and our farmers. But Conservatives will stand up, fight back against this radical Liberal agenda, axe the tax, and make sure we provide relief to our farmers, families, and First Nations.
The honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
On this day in 1989, a man entered a quiet university library in Montreal and deliberately murdered 14 women because they were women. Decades later, we're still holding vigils for women and girls murdered because of their gender. 184 femicides in Canada just last year. That's one woman or girl every 48 hours. My city of Hamilton, like more than 40 other Canadian cities, has declared gender-based violence an epidemic. Not just physical violence, but psychological abuse and economic coercion. These affect a woman's ability to provide for herself, to care for her children, and lead to more homelessness among women. Women's shelters in Canada are over full. Our government's National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence directly supports frontline organizations. We're making housing more affordable, and we're addressing mental health, and we're bringing men's voices into the solution because gender-based violence is not a woman's issue.
Hear, hear. Questions? Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Today, we honor the victims of the Polytechnique shooting, and we want to end violence against women. We also think about the people who cannot eat this Christmas. We have stories of children who are writing letters to Santa Claus not to ask for presents, but to ask for food. And 25% of young Quebecers have told pollsters that they cannot eat because of the cost. The Prime Minister, did he force his senators to keep the tax on food for Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, today we honor the memory of 14 young women who were assassinated at Polytechnique School in Montreal, simply because they were women. We honor their memory, and we continue to fight against inequality and gender-based violence. We must all continue to pursue reform against assault-style weapons, including the fight against femicide. Tragedies like the one at Polytechnique should never occur again.
Of the Official Opposition.
Sir Premier Minister.
This Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing. He's doubled the cost of housing since he came to power. But yesterday at the Senate, one of the senators asked the Speaker of the President of the Government Agency for Housing if there was a plan to add 4.5 million necessary units to make for affordable housing, and the answer was no. I'm not the one saying this. It's the President of the Federal Agency for Housing. When will the Prime Minister look at my documentary to find a common sense plan to eliminate tax and red tape to build houses? The Right Honourable Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, Canadians see very clearly the hashtags and YouTube trends from the Conservative Party. They have never seen a social program that he did not want to get rid of, and there would have been no funding during the pandemic. There would have been nothing to stabilize grocery prices. There's nothing to fight against climate change under them. They think that Canadians will be fooled, but we know who this leader is truly.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
What Canadians know is that the Prime Minister has doubled housing costs, doubled the rent, doubled mortgage payments, doubled the needed down payment After 8 years, Mr. Speaker, our housing costs have worsened at a greater rate than all but one OECD country. And yesterday, a senator asked the head of the Prime Minister's own housing agency if there is a federal government plan to eliminate the 3.5 million home deficit that we have in Canada. The answer? No. It's not me saying that. It's his own housing agency. So given that he doesn't have a plan, why doesn't he watch the common sense housing documentary I put forward so that he can see a common sense plan to cut bureaucracy and build homes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is shameful that the Conservative leader is exploiting the very real anxieties and fears of Canadians for clicks and views. This leader continues to demean co-ops as Soviet-style housing. He called a Niagara family's home a shack, and he keeps using homeless people as props. A responsible leader acts on the concerns of Canadians instead of exploiting them for political gain just so he can get his 15 minutes.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
What is shameful is that this Prime Minister is causing homelessness in this country. He's caused a doubling of the number of people eating at a food bank in Toronto. One single mother in Sydney said, well, this month I had to choose between eating and having heat. My kids are getting fed, but my house is freezing, end quote. The Prime Minister's solution is to quadruple the carbon tax on that single mother and on seniors. Mr. Speaker, we have a common sense Conservative bill to take the carbon tax off farmers and food. Why did the Prime Minister manipulate and intimidate Liberal senators into blocking that bill? Why does he want to tax food right before Christmas?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after all the intimidation and threats from the Conservatives towards parliamentarians on 234, it turns out the only farming the Conservative Party cares about is rage farming. Because all of this was just an attempt to fundraise off of the backs of farmers. Time and time again, the Conservative leader has shown that he wants to take Canadians back to the Stone Age instead of helping them get ahead. On this side of the House, the Liberal government will always be there to support farmers.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, as this Prime Minister raises taxes on food, brings back malnutrition, brings in record-smashing food bank use, the best he can come up with is a bunch of scripted talking points from junior staffers in the PMO. That is outrageous. Canadians are going hungry as Christmas is just around the corner, and a common-sense Conservative bill to take the tax off farmers and food could have helped solve the problem. Why did he manipulate and intimidate senators to keep the tax on the food and make our people go hungry right before Christmas?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we have an opposition leader who is so ideologically opposed to protecting the planet that he's willing to take Parliament hostage and stop Parliament from supporting workers, stop Parliament from supporting families, and stop Parliament from supporting Ukraine as well. The leader of the opposition has threatened to ruin the holidays if his ideological demands are not met. Let us be clear. We will keep working for Canadians while the Conservative leader is only fueled by the sound of his own voice and has no real plan for this country. We will never back down from supporting Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Ballet-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, while people who want to be Prime Minister and try to paralyze the Parliament, there's work to be done. For example, the government appointed Madame Catherine Tate as the interim CEO of CBC Radio Canada. Her mandate, fight against disinformation. Mr. Speaker, fighting against disinformation. How? By cutting jobs in French in the regions. Does the PM agree with me that Ms. Tate should explain to Parliament her surprising decision? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have always supported CDUC Radio-Canada and the services it provides in local communities across our country. One of the first measures that we took as a government was to cancel the Harper cuts to this public broadcaster, support local news and journalists during these tough times. And this is exactly the reason why we established C-18. While the Leader of the Opposition celebrates these Canadians who are facing job cuts, we continue to support local journalists, local information across Canada. We're very open to work with the Bloc on this, as always. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Ballet-Chambly. I hope we will not conclude that Liberal cuts are better than those from the Conservative Party. Radio-Canada is consulted by more people in Canadian than CBC. Radio-Canada generates more publicity, advertising income than CBC. In fact, French Radio-Canada subsidizes English services at CBC. Yet Ms. Tate is asking French Radio-Canada to accept half of the cuts she's asking for on the back of French and on the back of the regions. Should the Prime Minister himself not call Ms. Kate to appear before parliamentarians to explain herself? Francophone members at the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, like the Leader of the Bloc knows very well, we'll always be here to defend both official languages in Canada, and we will look at the protection of French in particular, including in Quebec. CDUC Radio-Canada has an important mandate, and we are concerned by the situation all our media stations are facing with digitalization and online services and attacks from the Conservatives against the media, particularly at CBC Radio-Canada. And we'll always be here to defend journalists who are an essential pillar of our democracy.
Member for London Fanshawe.
3 women in London have been killed by their male partners over the past year. And our women's shelters are doing everything they can, but they just can't keep up. Anova's women's shelter had to turn people away 2,400 times this year. This is an epidemic. But what are the Liberals doing? Cutting funding to women's shelters when they need them the most. When will the Prime Minister reverse his $150 million cut to women's shelters?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, today and every day we reinforce that everyone has the right to live free from violence. We've made historic investments, including unprecedented investments during the pandemic to support shelters, and we're taking real action to end gender-based violence in our communities. We're also working with provinces and territories to develop a national action plan to prevent gender-based violence and support survivors. We know there is an urgent need for more action, and we will not stop until gender-based violence comes to an end.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
Indigenous women and their children are forced to live in violent situations because of the lack of adequate housing. The Liberals are actively keeping Indigenous peoples marginalized by delaying the release of housing investments promised. The NDP fought to secure $4 billion to help build homes Indigenous peoples need. But the Liberals keep delaying these investments, keeping Indigenous peoples out in the cold. When will this government help Indigenous communities get the homes they so desperately need?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are taking action to address housing gaps in Indigenous communities swiftly, effectively, and in equal partnership. Budget 2023 included an additional investment of $4 billion in the Indigenous housing strategy, on top of the $6.7 billion since 2015. In fact, since 2016, we've supported the construction and renovation of over 30,000 homes in First Nations communities, and we continue to work with First Nations partners to co-develop 10-year housing infrastructure strategy. We will continue working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, along with all levels of government, to co-develop and implement community-based housing solutions because they are desperately needed.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
A desperate and panicking Prime Minister spent the weekend calling Liberal senators, pleading with them to keep the carbon tax on farmers. Our common sense plan will take the tax off of the people who grow the food, ship the food, and as a result, Canadians who buy the food. Yesterday, he got his Christmas wish. Liberal senators gutted Bill C-234, a move that will keep food prices high while Canadians visit food banks in record numbers. So will he finally listen to the outcry? Will he listen to anyone but his globe-trotting activist environment minister and take the tax off so people can put food on their table this Christmas?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House. Well, we'll try it. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The only senators that sit in any caucus are Conservative senators, Mr. Speaker, and I would note that up to 1/3 of those Conservative senators did not vote yesterday. Mr. Speaker, climate change is driving food inflation, not pollution pricing. Farmers are on the front lines of climate change. They know about climate change. They experience the effects of droughts, flood, and storms firsthand, and unlike the Conservative Party, they have no problem saying climate change. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative strategy is to ignore climate change and stay hiding in the pockets of big oil and gas. That is no strategy at all, and it is risky and reckless.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, every single senator who voted against this bill was a Liberal senator. The Prime Minister's carbon tax has already ruined Christmas for millions of Canadian families. So Conservatives are going to ruin Christmas vacation for this Prime Minister and his Liberal MPs. We will stay here as long as it takes to force them to axe the tax so the Canadians can afford gas, groceries, and home heating. So, Mr. Speaker, how long are we going to be here? Is it 1 week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 3 weeks until this Prime Minister finally relents and cancels his carbon tax on farmers, on families, and on First Nations?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the Conservatives who had their senators bully independent senators in the other place, we will stand up to the bullies on the other side. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to stand for Canadians every single day. And we know that when we put a price on pollution with the rebate, Canadians get more back than they pay. If the Conservatives cared about Canadians and their affordability challenges, they would support the price on pollution because it is putting money in their pockets. But typical Conservative style, they take from the poor to give to the rich. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this weekend it was the Prime Minister that was bullying the senators, calling them up and telling them to kill Bill C-234, a common sense bill to help farmers and families. And the Senate, you know, they listened to him. They gutted the bill, okay? But people are suffering. People are hungry. The food bank use in my riding is up over 100%. So will the Prime Minister finally listen to Canadians and take the carbon tax off farmers, First Nations, and families?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other place actually found one of the Conservative senators in breach of privilege for the actions that he took bullying independent senators, Mr. Speaker. That member should be cognizant of the fact that independent senators can make their own decisions. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting Canadians, this government has been there the entire time, whether it was through supporting millions of Canadians through the pandemic, whether it's supporting them through the social safety net that the Conservatives are looking to gut with their cuts. Mr. Speaker, in typical Conservative fashion, they're looking to take from the poor and give to the rich. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's this Liberal government that's trying to make everybody poor. But, you know, the Prime Minister, he's determined to ruin Christmas for Canadians. And so Conservatives will ruin his vacation. We will stay here and we will fight until he decides to take the carbon tax off families, farmers, and First Nations. Will he do it?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, Mr. Speaker, party opposite continues to spread information that is simply incorrect. When they're talking about the vote in the other place, they should really be asking the Conservative senators who sit in that caucus why they didn't show up to vote yesterday. Mr. Speaker, if they truly cared about it, that would have been the question that they were asking instead of posing this to the government that has nothing to do with the independent Senate. But what we do on this side of the House is we support farmers. We're going to be there for farmers. We're going to be there for all Canadians like we have been since 2015. We're going to keep delivering for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's just all take a deep breath.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, everything cost more, and unfortunately it's not over yet. We know that the bill adopted C-234, and even the Greens voted with us, but then it would have given us some tax breaks for farmers. But then the Prime Minister picked up the phone and personally called senators to make sure that Bill C-234 would be gutted, and then unfortunately it worked, and that's the problem. Why is the Prime Minister always so intent on taking even more money out of families' pockets in Canada? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, I have enormous respect for my colleague, but he knows that the only party that is in this House that is trying to take money from Canadians is the Conservatives. Cancelling the price on pollution will leave most Canadians worse off than they are now. And if they have questions for senators, why did the Conservative senators not vote yesterday? On this side of the House, we respect democratic institutions, but we know that's not the case for the Conservatives. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. I also have a great deal of respect for the Minister, but I'd like her to explain that how come they want to seek even more money from the pockets of Canadians, and that's exactly what they're doing. But we have the solution with Bill C-234, which gives Canadian farmers a break. It means that food will not continue to rise like it has under this Liberal government. And once again, the Liberals will rely on their senators to attack this bill. When will this government and people understand that it costs a lot to vote for this Liberal government? The Honourable Government House Leader. It costs expense a lot. That's what the Conservatives would do. They would take money from the pockets of Canadians. They voted against an increase in the CCB and an increase in OIS for seniors. They voted against dental benefits for lower-income Canadians. On this side of the House, we understand that we have to be there to support Canadians, and that's something that I would like the Conservative Party understand as well. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, the number to retain this week is 2,000. 2,000 is the number of meetings the Liberals have held with fossil fuel lobbyists since last year. 2,000 meetings in 2 years with oil companies. We know that numbers don't lie. And when a Liberal gives you a choice between listening to what he's saying and looking at the numbers, do like me and choose the numbers. Look at the numbers. The Liberals tell us day after day that they agree, but I have a simple question for them. Do they realize that the numbers suggest that they're leaning towards black oil? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important to have meetings with all stakeholders in the economy. Yes, it includes the oil sector, but also environmentalist groups. 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with Environmental Defense, with many green groups, to have conversations that are very important. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Figures don't lie, Mr. Speaker. 2,000 meetings between the Liberals and fossil fuel lobbyists since last year. The PMO has met with oil companies twice as often as with environmental groups. And on the finance side, it's even four times more often. Does this have an impact on policies? Well, let's follow the money trail. The Liberals' flagship environmental measure in Bill C-59 is $30.3 billion in oil company subsidies. When will the Liberals base their policies on the climate crisis rather than the oil companies whining? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've already said, it's important for us to hold meetings with participants of all sectors of our economy. And of course, I had many meetings with the Bloc as well. But I'd like to say that we did announce this week new regulations to reduce methane by 75%. And it's the first country worldwide that has made this commitment. It's something that's very important to fight climate change, and we are very proud of this.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister spent the weekend pressuring Liberal senators, demanding that they kill our Conservative bill that would axe the carbon tax for Canadian farmers. Yesterday, those senators bowed to their political master. They used every dirty trick in the book to gut the bill. Mr. Speaker, the truth is, these Liberals aren't hurting us. They're hurting hungry Canadians who can't afford these higher prices for their food. Why won't the Prime Minister park his ideological admiration for higher taxes for Canadians and give Canadians a Christmas miracle and finally axe the tax for farmers, First Nations and families?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, there's no Liberal senators, and the Conservative senators didn't even vote. Mr. Speaker, we already know the Conservatives don't believe in climate change, but it seems like they don't believe in math either. University of Calgary-based economists conducted a thorough review of our price on pollution, and facts are facts, Mr. Speaker. 94% of families who earn less than $50,000 receive more back through our price on pollution than they pay. But in typical Conservative fashion, Mr. Speaker, the member from Carleton and his merry band of climate change deniers want to steal from the poor and give to the rich. It's risky and reckless, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the most ridiculous answer I've heard in this House today. There's only one group in this House that's trying to take away from those that are most vulnerable. When will these Liberals finally understand that if you tax the Liberals, if you tax the farmers that grow the food and the truckers that ship the food, it's eventually going to be cost more for Canadians to buy the food. When will he set aside his ideological attachment to the carbon tax and finally give a break to farmers, First Nations, and Canadian families this Christmas?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers are on the front lines of the climate crisis. They are the first to feel the effects of floods and droughts. And, Mr. Speaker, wheat yields are down 20% in 2023. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? It's climate change. Yet, unlike these Conservatives, farmers have no problem identifying climate change as the culprit for the reduction in their yields, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of wheat, if the Conservatives really want to support food security, then they should support the breadbasket of Europe, Mr. Speaker. That's Ukraine. Ukraine says they need assistance in strengthening economic resilience, yet they voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. I'd urge them to reconsider that shameful vote in third reading.
The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Liberal-appointed senators voted to gut common-sense Conservative Bill C-234, an action that betrays farmers. For the last decade, this PM has repeatedly made the claim that the Senate and those he appoints to it are independent, yet this weekend proved otherwise. He and his Socialist Environment Minister were busy employing a campaign of bullying and pressure to force his senators to kill this needed carbon tax carve-out. The carbon tax is punishing the farmers who produce the food and the folks that need it. Will this Prime Minister finally just listen to Canadians and axe his carbon tax?
Hey, hey. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable colleague is well aware the other place makes a decision on their own. We do not. The Conservative Party of Canada has senators in their caucus. The Conservative Party of Canada does not have a policy or a plan for the environment. But I can assure my honourable colleague that we do have a plan for the environment, and that's why we're able to make an investment of $1.5 billion to help farmers, processors reduce their environmental footprint. Mr. Speaker, we have and will continue to support our farmers and ranchers in this country.
I just want to say, I mean, as I said, the Honourable Minister sits right here. I can barely hear him. So let's try to keep the sound down a little bit. The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, I know for a fact that farmers are asking that minister to axe the carbon tax. That PM promised that the Senate would be independent, but the actions this past week prove that that is a complete farce. We know he bullied his senators. The PM himself was on the phone over the weekend telling them they had to gut Bill C-234. The Prime Minister lied, and his minions continue to lie about
here at the same time I did knows full well that you can't use that word. I would say the honourable member should retract that and apologize. The honourable member Battle River Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, I will not apologize to that Prime Minister when he continues to lie about the carbon tax and the so-called independence of the Senate.
I'm asking the honourable member to apologize for the second time and retract that word. The honourable member knows full well you cannot use that word in this chamber. So this is the last opportunity. The honourable member of Battle River Crowfoot, will you be retracting that?
It's the truth. It's the truth. I will not apologize to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Couric, would you mind leaving us today? Let me fill this. I have to name you for the disregarding the authority of the chair. Pursuant to the authority granted by me, Standing Order 11, I order you to withdraw from the House from any participation by video conference for the remainder of this sitting day. But he did leave. I'm just going to take a bit of a break here. The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, in Canada, over half of women with disabilities are living on less than $10,000 a year. They can't afford the medication they need, nutritious food, or housing. And for women with disabilities who are facing intimate partner violence, they can't afford to get away or to move out of their homes. The Liberals have failed these women. Will the Prime Minister stop endangering women with disabilities by releasing the Canada Disability Benefit now?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for that really important question. Mr. Speaker, it also gives me a chance to first and foremost acknowledge that this past Sunday was International Day for Persons with Disabilities, an opportunity for all of us to continue to do the hard work to create a barrier-free Canada and to ensure that we create equal opportunities for persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, on Canada Disability Benefit, the honourable member knows very well we are absolutely committed to getting it right and getting it out quickly as possible, but in the true spirit of nothing without us. Mr. Speaker, online public consultations who are fully accessible are available online for regulations, and I hope that all Canadians will participate.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend violence between Israel and Hamas resumed. More Palestinian children and humanitarian workers have been killed in Netanyahu's bombardment, and there are still many people being held hostage by Hamas. Doctors Without Borders convoys in Gaza were attacked and destroyed, and aid trucks have been blocked. This is not eliminating Hamas. This is destroying an entire population. And yet the Liberals and the Conservatives refuse to call for a ceasefire. Why is the government's position so cowardly in the face of this humanitarian disaster?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, for
course, we unequivocally condemn the terrorist attacks that happened on October 7th against innocent Israeli civilians. As we, of course, think that it is completely unacceptable that so many women and children, civilians in Gaza, have died during the context of this crisis. The cycle of violence will not ensure Israel's long-term security, and the price of justice cannot be the suffering of all Palestinian people. The violence must stop. Thank you.
The honourable member for Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we remember the 14 young women who were killed during the École Polytechnique massacre. As the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence comes to an end, we are reminded that our work must continue until we achieve a Canada free of gender-based violence. Can the Minister of Women and Gender Equality and Youth update the House on how our government is addressing the prevention of gender-based violence? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question, and today we remember the victims of the massacre at École Polytechnique. The brazen disregard of the safety of women and the clear intent to harm them casts a shadow on our hearts to this day. And even now, gender-based violence remains a real threat for women. Because of this, our commitment to end it has not changed. That's why we have signed 10 agreements alongside provinces and territories through the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. And this work will not stop, Mr. Speaker, until it ends.
The honourable member for Regina Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, today Canadians across the country are feeling betrayed. Betrayed by this Prime Minister's senators who voted to gut Conservative Bill C-234, a bill that would have provided carbon tax relief for Canadian farmers and for Canadian families who are just trying to put food on the table. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, will this Prime Minister end his carbon tax obsession and provide relief for Canadians so they can stop turning to food banks?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows, there are no senators on this side of the House. The only senators that are in a political party are those that are Conservative. Perhaps the member opposite would like to ask why 13 Conservative senators didn't show up to vote. Is it perhaps because they don't support the leader's position on Ukraine and recognize that if they truly cared about making food more affordable, they might actually support the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement? But the questions he has to ask are to the Conservative senators who didn't vote for their bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, the minister can say whatever she wants, but when the minister is phoning his Liberal-appointed senators and instructing them how to gut the bill, it's pretty hard to believe them. Common sense Conservatives will axe the tax, removing the carbon tax from Canadian farmers, making food cheaper for all Canadians. The Prime Minister continues to stand in the way of Canadian farmers and punish them with this carbon tax. When will the Prime Minister set aside his ideological opposition to the carbon tax and remove it for all farmers, families, and First Nations?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, but once again, that member knows full well, and although he's not sharing it with Canadians, that the only senators that sit in a political party are Conservative senators, and they didn't show up to vote yesterday. So he should really ask why they didn't do that. Perhaps they have an issue with some of the positions that his leader has taken. So if he cares about the high cost of living, if he cares about food prices, then he should simply change his vote on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, because that is causing the most significant inflation when it comes to food prices, as is climate change. And so he should check his ideological opposition to fighting climate change. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Beauce.
The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, this desperate, panicking Prime Minister spent his weekend calling senators, begging them to kill Bill C-234. And yesterday, unsurprisingly, the Senate voted for an amendment that would empty Bill C-234 of all substance. That would keep food at an exorbitant price. At a time when Canadians are struggling, will this Prime Minister finally stop trying to radically increase the carbon tax on farmers and families? Finally. The Honourable Minister of Transport, where was this member when there were forest fires and floods this summer, when people had to leave their homes? Where was he when it came time to see the impact of climate change on people, on farmers? And where was he this morning? Because this morning I was at the Liberal caucus and there were no senators, whereas he was at his caucus where there are plenty of senators. So he should tell the truth. Well, I just asked someone to leave because of the use of the word truth. It's almost the same thing here, talking about truth or lies, so I would ask the member to be careful. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Well, I'm connected with what's happening on the ground. My colleague may not be aware of this. There are direct impacts on farmers, including in Quebec, because the propane we use in Quebec comes from outside, so we pay for it. So, Mr. Speaker, we will not allow the economic statement from last week to pass. In fact, the government hasn't even tried to bring it to the floor for debate, and agriculture is not even in the bill. The word agriculture is not even there. With record levels at our food banks, won't this government help food prices to go down? So I repeat my question. I hope my colleague will answer it this time. When will the Prime Minister finally give up his idea of radically increasing the carbon tax? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's say things very clearly. Pricing pollution reduces pollution and puts more money into the pockets of 8 out of 10 families. Now, in terms of the number of families in Beauce receiving the child care benefit, well, it's 9 out of 10 families in that riding. They're receiving the Canada Child Benefit. And yet, the Conservative leader voted against the Canada Child Benefit. He voted against the interests of 9,000 families in Beauce. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We now know that it was the Prime Minister who interfered with the public competition for the Afghanistan Mission Monument. And we know that he's the one who strategized to reverse the jury's decision and make sure that the Quebec team, the Daoud team, would lose. Yesterday, the House of Commons spoke, led by the Bloc Québécois. The House condemned the government's 180 and the fact that it's not respecting its own rules. Will the Prime Minister listen to the House and reverse his decision to push aside the winning team, the Quebec team? The Honourable Minister for Veterans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. The Department of Veterans Affairs decided to do this because we chose to listen to veterans. More than 12,000 veterans, more than 12,000 Canadians filled out a survey and poll, and most of them were veterans. And they clearly said that the Stimson concept better represented veteran sacrifice and valor. That's why that decision was taken, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, these Liberals deliberately rejected Quebec. There was a competition in the case of the monument. Quebec won, and yet the Prime Minister decided to topple that decision. So Quebec was pushed aside. Now, in the Boeing against Bombardier file, the Liberals didn't even leave it to chance. They didn't even offer a bid for tender, so there was no chance for Quebec to win. But the result was the same in both cases. In both cases, the Liberals strategized to push aside Quebec and make it lose a federal contract. Why? The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs. Let's be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Veterans Affairs ultimately chose the Stimson's concept. We listened to veterans. We created a survey. Thousands of Canadians answered the survey. Most of them were veterans. Mr. Speaker, I just don't understand why my honourable colleague doesn't want to listen to veterans. Because once again, there's the one who made the ultimate sacrifice in the Afghanistan mission.
Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians know the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. He spent the weekend making desperate and panic-stricken phone calls to senators, pleading with them to kill Bill C-234. And yesterday, that's exactly what they did when they voted to gut the bill and keep food prices high for struggling Canadians.
When will the Prime Minister listen to Canadians, take the carbon tax off farmers, First Nations, and families that just want to heat their homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We don't need Conservatives to tell us how to help farmers, Mr. Speaker. Farmers are the most impacted by climate change. The last season was one of the worst, with 20% lower wheat yields in the prairies, Mr. Speaker, and the culprit was a hotter season. That's climate change, Mr. Speaker. Now, we already know that Conservatives don't believe in climate change, but it seems like they don't believe in math either, Mr. Speaker. 94% of families that earn less than $50,000 a year receive more back from the price on pollution than they spend. But it's typical. It's an old story, Mr. Speaker. These Conservatives just want to steal from the poor and give to the rich, with the leader from Carleton and his merry climate change deniers.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe Grey.
Mr. Speaker, Liberal-appointed senators voted yesterday to keep the carbon tax pain on Canadian families and once again betray farmers by gutting Bill C-234.
Unbelievable.
With food bank usages at a record high, the Prime Minister should have the courage to explain why he instructed senators to keep food prices high for struggling Canadians.
That's right.
After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister listen to Canadians and take the carbon tax off farmers, First Nations, and families that are struggling to get by?
Axe the tax.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And being a farmer and meeting farmers right across the country, one of the first questions they ask me, how come the Conservative Party of Canada does not have a plan to deal with the environment? When you look at all the fires, all the floods, all the destruction that's taken place. But I told them we do have a plan. We do have a plan, and an example of that plan is with the Minister of Agriculture from Ontario, we're able to announce a $25 million program in order to make sure that farmers remain on the cutting edge. But farmers are able to produce crops that are strong in areas that are more moisture, and we, as I said, Mr. Speaker, continue.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's hand-picked senators voted to keep the carbon tax on farmers and keep food costs high.
Shameful.
In Edmonton, the Veterans Food Bank is pleading for donations to help our veterans, and that is the legacy of this Prime Minister. Food banks are veterans begging for help. When will the Prime Minister listen to Canadians and take the carbon tax off farmers, First Nations, and families who are just desperate to heat their homes?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, as I said previously, being a farmer and talking to farmers, they cannot understand how a Conservative Party of Canada would not have a plan to deal with the environment. When you deal with situations like Fiona in Atlantic Canada, totally destroying properties, destroying dairy barns, killing animals. In fact, that's part of the cost for the price on food. Mr. Speaker, we have and will continue to support farmers. For an example, dealing with Minister Thompson in Ontario, we announced $25 million to make sure farmers stay on the cutting edge. We have and will continue to support farmers.
Were you just doing a standing order 31 there?
The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, too often people in Waterloo Region and across Canada lose loved ones to overdoses caused by the increasingly toxic illegal drug supply. People who are struggling needs all level of governments to work together and a comprehensive and evidence-based substance use policy. We know that stigma and fear won't solve this crisis. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions inform Canadians on the harm caused by stigmatizing the toxic drug and overdose crisis? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
I want to thank the member for his question. Mr. Speaker, common sense without science means loved ones lost. Raising stigma is killing people who need our help. I was shocked to learn that Conservatives kept interrupting experts at Health Committee. If the overdose crisis was truly a priority, they would listen to experts and follow the facts. Our evidence-based plan includes prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and law enforcement. We're not pitting one pillar against another, Mr. Speaker. We're using all the tools needed to save lives. Reckless and risky games stoke fear. We need to work together and fight this crisis to save lives.
The Honourable Member for Moose Jaw, Lake Centre, Lanigan.
Mr. Speaker, a desperate, panicked Prime Minister spent this past weekend calling senators pleading to kill C-234. Yesterday, his NDP Liberal government got their wish when the senators betrayed farmers, gutting this important bill, keeping the carbon tax. This keeps food prices high and farmers struggling. Farmers across Canada buy goods they need retail and sell what they produce wholesale. Mr. Speaker, after 8 long years, farmers know this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. If he won't help our farmers, when will he get out of the way so a Conservative government can?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, when I hear from everyday Canadians about affordability, when I hear from people like Lindsay in my riding, when I hear from former classmates like Stephanie, what they say to me is that the cost of food is going up, but they understand it's a complex problem. Climate change feeds into the cost of food. Things like instability overseas in Europe and an illegal war in Ukraine affect the price of food. Ergo, we just wonder about the sincerity of the party opposite when they vote against instrumental measures like affordability piece of legislation or legislation that will assist Ukraine and stop that illegal war.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat, Cardston Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you ate today, thank a farmer. If you couldn't afford to eat today, thank these Liberals.
Right.
Our farmers spent their days working hard to ensure that Canadians have enough food. The NDP Liberal government spends their days developing new ways to tax Canadians and drive up costs. The Conservatives proposed Bill C-234 to take the carbon tax off farmers. But this piece of work Prime Minister has pressured his appointed senators to block this bill. After 8 years, will the Prime Minister finally get his hands out of the pockets of farmers, families, and First Nations and axe the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's time that the Conservative Party stopped misleading Canadians with respect to these issues. I certainly would invite them to read the article that the University of Calgary economist Trevor Toome put out yesterday, which basically showed that 95% of Canadians on low and moderate incomes get more money back. Rather than talking about axe the tax, they should be talking about axe the rebate and taking money out of the pockets of hard-working Canadians.
Only got a few more to go, folks. The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Lillette, Kamouraska.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Lillette, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, farmers wanted a break on the carbon tax, but unfortunately the Senate voted for an amendment that empties Bill C-234 of all substance. Food prices will remain very high at a time when Canadians are struggling. And we certainly can't count on the costly Bloc Liberal coalition to help them. Will the Prime Minister finally abandon his plan to increase the carbon tax on farmers and families? They just can't take it anymore, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to understand the Conservatives' obsession with undermining the fight against climate change. I just don't understand. And they don't even seem to recognize the existence of climate change, and they're doing everything to avoid doing something about it. Earlier, they were asking us to speak with our senators, and they asked us to stop speaking with them. We don't even have any senators. They have plenty of senators. They should talk to their senators. Their senators didn't even show up to vote. They should fix their own problem.
Sudbury.
The Honourable Member for Sudbury. Mr. Speaker, today we remember the 14 young women who were killed during the École Polytechnique massacre. We must continue to work hard to end gender-based violence in Canada. Could the Minister for Women and Gender Equality update the House on the work our government is doing to ensure that a senseless massacre like this never happens again? The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for her question. Mr. Speaker, today we are taking time to remember the mothers, sisters, daughters from throughout the country who have been taken from us due to this senseless and avoidable violence. Gender-based violence must and shall not be tolerated in Canada. Our government will fight to end gender-based violence. We need firearms control legislation and a national action plan to end gender-based violence.
The honourable member for Churchill-Kiwatinuk-Askey.
Mr. Speaker, this past summer was the worst wildfire season in Canada's history. Indigenous communities are on the front lines of the climate crisis and are disproportionately paying the price. Yet Liberals are investing less than a third of all emergency preparedness money in prevention, choosing to be reactive. First Nations like Bloodvein, that's been evacuated because of wildfires, does not have a fire truck to this day. The AFN is asking for $30 billion in mitigation. The Liberal spending on mitigation is a drop in the bucket. Why are the Liberals pretending this reality is acceptable for First Nations and Indigenous communities facing the climate crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Dealing with significant wildfire season because of climate change. And it's impacting the most vulnerable, especially when it comes to our Indigenous communities. I've traveled. Every time I've gone to visit the disaster-affected areas, I do meet with the Indigenous communities. One of the things that we are looking at is making sure that we use their knowledge in terms of mitigation and making sure that we have the appropriate response for us. We are going to get this right, Mr. Speaker, to making sure that the Indigenous have the support to actually support us in the wildfire response. Thank you.
And the honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Sudanese Canadians have been advocating since April for this government's definition of immediate family member to include siblings, parents, and grandparents amidst escalating violence and reports of ethnic cleansing in Sudan. Now, Canadians with family in Gaza are living this same horror. While I appreciate the minister has rightfully admitted at committee that the definition probably should be expanded, nothing has yet changed. When will the minister fix this definition so that Sudanese and Palestinian Canadians can bring their family to safety?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can't stress more to members of the House how difficult it is actually to get people out of Gaza in a war zone faced with a humanitarian disaster. Our priority remains permanent residents and Canadian families. We are looking at options to expand that to make sure that people connected to Canada can be afforded a safe haven. But again, this is work in progress, and it is extremely difficult to get people out at this time, but we will continue to work hard to do so. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
And that's all the time for question period we have today. We do have an introduction. I wish to draw the attention of the members in the presence of the gallery of the Honourable Nils Clark, Minister of Highways, Public Works, and Minister of Environment of the Yukon. Moment of silence. Following discussions among representatives of all parties in the House, I understand there is an agreement to observe a moment of silence. I would now invite the House to rise and observe a minute of silence in memory of the victims of the tragic event that happened 34 years ago at École Polytechnique in Montréal. Merci beaucoup. Now we have a couple of points of order. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I think if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion. Given that the CBC announced it is cutting 600 jobs and 250 de ces emplois.
And 250 of these jobs.
I'm already hearing a number of no's.
No.
I'm already hearing a number of. We've changed a little bit on when we hear a number of no's, when we just move on to the next item. So that the honourable member, the honourable leader of the official opposition.
There must be a misunderstanding, because surely the Liberals don't want to give bonuses to CBC executives while killing jobs of CBC workers. They must have. The problem is they haven't listened to the motion.
I can't hear anything, so I wouldn't know if it was. I wouldn't know it was debate because I can't hear him.
Of the people
the honourable leader
working for it while giving bonuses to the executives. Clearly, that's not what they're. Oh, it is. That is what they're calling for. What a shame, Mr. Speaker. What a terrible shame.
Thank you. I believe another point of order from the Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today during question period, it was very clear and very much appreciated when the member from Battle River, Crowfoot, used unparliamentary language. He was asked to leave the chamber. But, Mr. Speaker, upon reflection of it, I would ask that you take a listen to all the proceedings that had taken place during that commotion, and you will find, I think, some very outrageous things that were being said, and we would ask that you consider not acknowledging the member's right to speak until he formally apologizes to the House.
I mean, ultimately, we will go back and listen to the event. I can only rule on things that I heard on the microphone, and of course, the honourable member was the one that had said it that I was aware. So, okay, let's go on to the next item. It being 3:24, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the amendment of Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West, to the motion to concur in the 26th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Call in the members.
The question is as follows. Mr. Macaulay.
Move that the 26th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts presented on Tuesday, February 14th, 2023 be concurred in. Mr. Calkins, the amendment. Mr. Calkins, seconded by Mr. Soroka, move the following amendment. That the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. May I dispense? No. Quote, the 26th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts presented on Tuesday, February 14, 2023, be now concurred in, but that it would be recommitted to the committee with the instruction that A, it take note of the resignation of the CEO and Chair of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, over allegations that funds were used improperly, namely that SDTC had been accused of giving grants to startups and accelerators with ties to their senior management, as well as making payments inconsistent with the requirement of their agreement with government. And B, in keeping with the Auditor General's observation, the Treasury Board, which is responsible for the supervision of SDTC, has not provided oversight, as well as SDTC's mission statement, claiming it has, quote, committed to full transparency, end of quote. The committee add to its recommendations an invitation to Annette Vishurin and the whistleblowers who exposed this scandal to appear before the committee, end of quote.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the amendment will please rise.
true? Did I do that?
Yes, you did.
Let's see, nobody. I always have some friends over here helping me out. They didn't help me out this time. Apologize. I have associates. Which line? Be not, okay. Be not now read. I'm sure it was in be not now read. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started in the House and now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Bien.
Madame Bien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Miss Gladue.
Miss Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morans.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Wilkinson. Correction, Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
All those opposed to the amendment will please rise.
Miss Gould.
Miss Gould.
Mr. Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Grove.
Miss Grove.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Miss Ian.
Miss Ian.
Miss Jazek.
Miss Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Miss O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Lozon.
Monsieur Lozon.
Mr. Kuzmerichek.
Mr. Kuzmerichuk.
Miss Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sidhu Bramptonese.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakono.
Monsieur Yakono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Shifke.
Monsieur Shifke.
Miss Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Miss Latanzio.
Miss Latanzio.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Henley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Miss Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Miss Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Ashton.
Miss Ashton.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Miss Cirillo.
Ms. Arillo.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Descharlet.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
I would like to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote because of technical issues, they now can activate the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre. Nay contre.
Candidates, anybody else? The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 111, 111. Nays contre 202, 202.
I declare the amendment defeated. The next question is on the main motion. The question is as follows. Monsieur Macaulay, Edmonton.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West, seconded by Mr. Couric, moved that the 26th report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts presented on Tuesday, February 14th, 2023, be concurred in.
Participant en personne désire que la...
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
Présidence. The honourable member for Edmonton West. Edmonton Mall. Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started. The House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Miss Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Miss Ian.
Ms. Ian.
Miss Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Miss O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Lamour.
Mr. Lamour.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Kuzmerichek.
Mr. Kuzmerichek.
Miss Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Monsieur Yacono.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Miss Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madam Shanahan.
Madam Shanahan.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sarbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zayed.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Miss Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Miss Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Henley.
Mr. Henley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. Nagvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Ashton.
Miss Ashton.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Miss Zarillo.
Miss Arillo.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Descharlet.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abutaif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Miss Gladu.
Miss Gladu.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicop.
Mr. Redicop.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Hello everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help support the channel.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Moss.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Hi guys, I've been away, so I just finally got back. I see they're voting on the second time they're voting.
Wish to inform the House the electronic voting period has ended.
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Monsieur Robillard.
Je vote pour, Monsieur le Président.
Yay pour.
Très bien. Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 202 202, nays contre 112 112.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion carried.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the amendment of Mr. Berthold in relation to the privilege motion. La question est la...
The question is as follows. Mr. Scheer, seconded by Mr. Berthold, moved that the Speaker's public participation at an Ontario Liberal Party convention as Speaker of the House of Commons constitutes a breach of the tradition and expectation of impartiality required for that high office. Constituting a serious error of judgment which undermines the trust required to discharge his duties and responsibilities, and therefore the House refer the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction that it recommend an appropriate remedy.
The amendment, Mr. Berthold, seconded by Mr. Tucker, moves the following amendment, that the motion be amended by adding the following, quote, provided that the committee, A, meet within 24 hours after receiving this order of reference to consider the matter, B, ensure this matter take priority over all other business, C, shall have the first priority for the use of House resources for the committee meetings, subject to the special orders adopted on Monday, May 16, 2023, and Monday, December 4, 2023, and D, be instructed to report back to the House not later than Thursday, December 14, 2023, end of quote. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the amendment will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Vith.
Mr. Vith.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladu.
Ms. Gladu.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Mazur.
Mr. Mazur.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné.
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Ashton.
Miss Ashton.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Miss Zarillo.
Miss Zarillo.
Monsieur Boulris.
Monsieur Boulris.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Descharlet.
Mr. Descharlet.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Okay. Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Groh.
Ms. Grove.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Miss Kara.
Miss Kara.
Miss Ian.
Ms. Ian.
Miss Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Brewston.
Mr. Brewson.
Mr. Lauzon.
Mr. Lauzon.
Mr. Kuzmerichek.
Mr. Kuzmerichuk.
Miss Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sidhu Bramptonese.
Mr. Cedar Bramptonese.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakono.
Mr. Yakono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Miss Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sarbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Miss Latenzio.
Miss Latenzio.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Bain.
Mr. Baines.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. Nagvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
I say all those opposed to the motion will please rise. The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before
Don't forget to like and subscribe. We will be back live again tomorrow as well. For those of you that don't know, I go live 5 days a week with the House of Commons. And on weekends, every once in a while, I'll do a Senate. What do you guys think is going to happen to Fergus? Is he going to resign, or is the committee going to have to place some sort of judgment? I think the honorable thing to do is step down. He should resign by now because it's just wasting taxpayers' money to have a committee debate over what they want to do about it. And all it is a game. Just a money game. He should just resign. Do the honorable thing and resign. All their voting from yesterday was deferred till today, so that's probably what they'll be doing half the night is voting.
I wish to inform the House the electronic voting period has ended. If members are not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function or show up in the chamber, and the chair will recognize them. Monsieur Robillard.
Je vote pour, Monsieur le Président.
Robillard, yea pour.
Took our notes. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 310, 310. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
I declare the amendment carried. The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading stage of Bill C-322 under private members' business. The question is as follows. Monsieur Cormier, appuyez.
Mr. Cormier, seconded by Mr. Rogers, moved that Bill C-322 enact to develop a national framework to establish a school food program. Be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Je vote pour, Monsieur le Président.
Pour.
We will now proceed to members participating in person.
Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. Nakfi.
Mr. Nakfi.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr. Mr. Carr.
All those at my left in the fifth row.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Now to prove that I have my right and my left correct, the members at my right in the Is it four? Fourth row.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Poutrakis.
Madame Poutrakis.
Madame Briere.
Madame Briere.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakino.
Mr. Yakino.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Third row.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
I think it's a national food framework. There's something like in the States and private schools, and some other schools have where they have food lunch that is served to them each day. That's what I believe in.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Deuxième rangée.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Scroll.
Miss Scroll.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Ms. Kara.
Miss Kara.
Ms. Ian.
Ms. Yen.
Ms. Jassic.
Miss Jazik.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
At my right in the first row.
Ms. Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Mr. Bouliris.
Monsieur Bouliris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
All those at my left in favor of the motion will please rise in the sixth row.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Ms. Zarillo.
Miss Arillo.
Cinquième rangée.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Ms. Barron.
Miss Barron.
Quatrième rangée.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
I find it hilarious the programs that they're coming out with. They can't even feed all Canadians as it is right now.
Mr. McGregor.
And yet they want to introduce a program to feed all kids.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Première rangée.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Ms. Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Ms. Ashton.
Miss Ashton.
All those at my right opposed to the motion, please rise in the sixth row, fifth row, fourth row, third row, second row, first row. All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise in the sixth row.
Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
In the fifth row.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motz.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Fourth row.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Reddicock.
Mr. Reddicock.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Luc.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Ms. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Troisième rangée.
100% Nicole charity. It starts at home.
Mr. Macaulay Edmondson West.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Bien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Deuxième rangée.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazin.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Beltud.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Abouteyev.
Mr. Abouteyev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
In the first row at my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
The House will now wait for electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Yeah, it's really upsetting to see Canadians on the streets families that can't feed themselves, their children, Canadians that are suffering, but they're suffering and the government has no problem giving our money away. Just give it to Ukraine because Ukraine needs it more, apparently, than the starving people living in tents that are probably going to die over the wintertime. I know Canada needs to adopt a Canada First policy where we take care of our own before we do anything else. I have no problem us sending money to other countries to help them out, etc. But we need to take care of our own first. No, the government doesn't care. The government we have right now seems like a sociopath. I mean, everyone in his caucus, they have strict talking points every question period. They say the same things. Like that elderly gentleman that for agriculture says the exact same thing every single time. No different. It doesn't matter what is being asked. He'll say the same talking point. It's like they only gave him a little bit of the script or something. Yeah, for him to come up and say that the one thing that farmers say the most or ask him the most is why don't the Conservatives have a climate action plan? I highly doubt that's exactly what they're saying. Why would they be asking that when they're paying thousands and thousands of dollars in carbon tax? I guarantee they're asking the government, why are we stuck paying all this? We're not the ones polluting. Why are we paying this? It's hurting the entire country. The Bloc only props up the Liberals because they're going to get some sort of kickback from the Liberals. That's the only reason why they propped them up. They had no right to do it when it came to the carbon tax because the Bloc doesn't pay the carbon tax like we do. They have a cap and trade between California, I believe it is.
Wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members are not able to vote due to technical difficulties, I ask them to use the raise hand function or stand in the chamber, and the House will recognize them. Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur le Président, je vote pour.
Robillard, yea pour.
I believe Mr. Hernandez-Sangri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I had some difficulties with my app, and I vote yes.
Hernandez-Sangri, yea pour.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 202 descendus. Nays contre, 110 sans 10.
I declare the motion is carried. Well, there should be according. Because normally there's a call, so to the clerk, second reading of this bill.
Second reading of this bill, deuxième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disability. Grab everything.
La Chambre procédera maintenant au...
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at third reading stage of Bill C-295 under private members' business.
Question is as follows. Ms. Fry, seconded by Mr. Lamoureux, move that Bill C-295, an act to amend the Criminal Code, neglect of vulnerable adults, be now read a third time and do pass. La période de 10 minutes pour...
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Oops, where are we? The honourable member for, say, Vancouver Centre. Elle n'est pas arrivée. So, qu'est-ce qui arrive? We will now proceed to the members participating in persons. Que tous ceux à ma droite qui...
All those at my right in favour of the motion will please rise.
Stoga. Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Bain.
Mr. Bain.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Cinquième rangée. À votre droite.
Fifth row.
Mr. Longfield. Mr. McLeod. Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Fourth row.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakino.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Third row.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr.
Monsieur
Arsenault.
Arsenault.
Madame
Madame
Lalonde.
Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms.
Ms. O'Connell.
O'Connell. Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Hota.
Mr. Hota.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Lozon.
Monsieur Lozon.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Second row.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Scroll.
Ms. Scroll.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Ian.
Ms. Ian.
Ms. Jassic.
Ms. Jazik.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
First row.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Mr. Bouliris.
Mr. Bouliris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
To all those members on my left who are in favor of the motion will please rise. Now, sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Miserillo.
Miserillo.
Fifth row.
Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolney.
Mr. Tolney.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens. Fourth.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row.
Ms. Barron.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row.
Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Leroux.
Monsieur Lou.
Mr. Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Miss Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Troisième rangée.
Third row.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Madame LaRouche.
Madame LaRouche.
Mr. Cannons.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Belton.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Abouteyev.
Mr. Abouteyev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Idlow.
Ms. Idlout.
Première rangée.
First row.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kmitch.
Mr. Kmitch.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Okay. All those on my right opposed to the motion will please rise. All those on my left opposed to the motion will please rise. La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
Give a like and subscribe to the channel. Yes, Duggo. Like, subscribe, and share to help support the channel. I think I'm going to be shutting the channel down after this vote. It looks like it's going to be votes all night, so it'll just be a lot of time wasted.
I would like to inform the House that the electronic voting period is over.
Vote due to technical difficulties. They may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them. L'honorable Monsieur Robillard.
Madame la Présidente, je vote pour.
Bien, yé pour.
Pas personne d'autre?
No one else?
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 309, 309. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
I declare the motion carried. La Chambre procédera maintenant.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at third reading stage of Bill C-295 under private members' business.
The question is as follows. Mr. Cannings, seconded by Ms. Barron, moved that Bill C-219 enact the Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights.
All right, everybody, I'm going to shut the channel down here before we go into another vote.
And refer to the Standing Committee
Have
on
a good night,
Environmental
and we will see you live tomorrow in the morning for the whole day.
The 10-minute voting period for members participating electronically has now begun. We'll start with the sponsor of the bill.
Okanagan, West Kootenay. Okay. All those on my right in favor of the, on the left in favor of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.